Okay, there are two different flagpoles here. One thing you should notice, we have the service emblems around. Go around the back side, you'll see the Merchant Marine and the Coast Guard. So the Coast Guard becomes a military service in time of war. The Merchant Marine was not a true military service, but we chose to honor them here because of their importance to our war effort, okay? The other thing I want you to notice about the flagpole, we have two flags on the flagpole. We have the American flag and we have the POW MIA flag. So the government has said only military installations and U.S. war memorials are authorized to fly both flags on the same pole. If you look at the Washington Monument, you can see the American flags arrayed around the Washington Monument, but no POW MIA flag. Okay? So let's go over here to the headstone and we'll talk about a couple things. You just line up over here and I'll get on this side so I can talk to you, okay? So one of the most important aspects of any memorial is where is it going to be, okay? So in Washington, D.C., we have a planning commission and the Fine Arts Commission. And the Congress always gets involved in things, and it wasn't the Friends of the World War, it was the World War II Memorial Committee decided this is where we would like to have the memorial. Now it took some convincing for the Planning Commission and the Fine Arts Commission to agree. The War II guy said, yeah, we don't care what you think. This is where we're going to put it. Now the first war memorial, National War Memorial that we built in Washington, D.C. was the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. We dedicated that in 1982. As soon as that happened, that opened the floodgates for all the other veterans organizations to say, what about us? That was nice, but what about us? So we took about the same footprint and allocated that for the Korean War veterans, okay? And the War II guys said, yeah, you're not going to put us in the corner, we belong right in the middle. And if you read the words here, that's what it says. We're right between the Washington Monument commemorating or honoring our first president and the Lincoln Memorial, the savior of our republic during the Civil War. And World War II was a seminal event for the United States in the 20th century, and we belong right in the middle. And here we are. So that's why this is here. Okay, it's just kind of a justification of this is what we're going to do. Okay. Now, as you look into the memorial, you will notice 12 bas reliefs on either side. The ones on the the south side to your left are nominally keyed to the Pacific Theater of War. The ones on your right side are nominally keyed to the Atlantic Theater of War. And what we did, we, the United States, decided to divide the world in two. If you're east of the United States, that's the Atlantic Theater of War. West of the United States, it's the Pacific Theater of War, and we did that for logistics because our assessment was, because we're really removed from where we need troops and bullets and food and fuel, we have to pay attention to the logistics. So you hear a lot about the great battles that we fought, great invasions we made, places like Guadalcanal, back into the Philippines, the battles in North Africa, but you don't hear anything at all about who was in charge of getting the oilers to the right place on time. The Pacific Ocean is pretty big, and if you don't get refueled on time, you're not going to have enough ships in the right place when we absolutely have to have them. So that's why when you look at this, I've got Atlantic on one side and Pacific on the other side, and we're talking about the theaters of war. So we'll look at the bas-reliefs as we go down. What I want you to notice about the bas-reliefs, two things. The artist started with a picture. So I've got 24 different pictures that his team started with. He and his team, Ray Caskey and the Caskey Studios in Maryland, did all of the bronze that's here. They made three-dimensional dioramas for all 24. And when they were satisfied that they had the story that we wanted to tell, they turned the three-dimensional diorama into a sand mold so we could cast the bronze. As you look at the bas-reliefs, you'll notice the people are all the same size. So just imagine that. If I said, okay, we have 30 people here, everybody give me one picture that has people in it, and I laid them all out, the people wouldn't be the same size. So that takes a lot of work to make that be so. The second thing you should notice is the people are in three dimensions. The idea is you, the visitor, can place yourself wherever it is, whether it's by the newsboy selling papers that says Germany declared war, or whether you're with the family over here listening to FDR's fireside chat talking about the invasion at Pearl Harbor, or you're with the chaplain holding a memorial service for soldiers who died, or you're with the medics over here. You can be there because that's the way the artist wanted to depict it. Okay? So as we go down into the memorial, you'll notice I have 56 granite columns around the rainbow pool. We're going to go down below ground level. One of the Fine Arts Commission's requirements to build a memorial here was you have to be below ground. So we're going to go about a story and a half below ground as we transit into the memorial. And the reason for that is we didn't want to break the sight line from Washington to Lincoln. So if you're on the base of the Washington Monument and you look this way, you can tell something's here, but it doesn't obstruct your view from Washington to Lincoln. Okay? That was really important. And the other part, we're on what I call the prime meridian. I've got the Capitol on the east end. I have Washington on the west end. Every structure that's here has a representation of all the states and territories at the time that we're trying to memorialize whatever it is. So when you go visit Statuary Hall underneath the rotunda, you'll find two statues given to the United States of America from all of the 50 states. So you can see King Kamehameha in his full glory, because that's one of the statues from Hawaii. Okay? If you could walk up the Washington Monument, all 555 feet, on the inside there are memorial stones presented to the United States from the state of New York or countries around the world in honor of George Washington. Okay? When you go visit Mr. Lincoln, the frieze around the top has all the states with the date they joined the Union in Roman numerals. There are 36 columns around that pantheon because there were 36 states when Lincoln was president. Right? 34 when we started the war, and we added 2. Right? We had West Virginia and Nevada. Okay? And here you're looking at the 1945 configuration. So being the teachers that you are, you know in 1945 we have 48 states. So they're arrayed in the order in which they joined the Union. The Freedom Wall is the center, Freedom Wall is the stars, and as the light fades you can't see it very well, but we're going to come back later in the week and you'll have an opportunity to see that. So with the Freedom Wall at your back, facing this, the formal entrance on 17th Street, the first column to the right is Delaware. Delaware was our first state in February 1787. The next most important, first column to the left, Pennsylvania was our second state, also February 1787. Okay. And then it's New Jersey and Georgia and Connecticut and Massachusetts and so on around the arc in a countervailing positioning until we get 48 states. New Mexico and Arizona were the last 2 of the original 48. 1912 they become states. And on either side I have 4 additional columns representing territories of the United States. So I have DC, Hawaii, Guam, Samoa on your left. On the right I have Alaska, Puerto Rico, Philippines, and Virgin Islands. They're all territories in 1945. Now, if I were to update that and say I want Alaska to be in the position it belongs as a state, Alaska would go where DC is, and Hawaii would go where Alaska is. Okay? But that doesn't happen until 1959, well before you were born. Okay? So, I have that. And the Philippines over here, Philippines, fully independent, July 4th, 1946. Okay, we had an idea that we should offer them independence in the 30s. General MacArthur, as the governor in the Philippines, convinced FDR it was a good idea, show the British that we know how to convert a colonial entity into an independent nation. And Japan got in the way. They invade Manchuria in 1937. MacArthur said all bets are off. We need to keep the U.S. flag flying in Manila as a deterrent to the Japanese. Didn't work out exactly the way MacArthur thought, but you get the idea. Okay, So after the war, we offered them full independence. They chose July 4th because they wanted to be absolutely aligned with the United States. So let's go down into the memorial and look at a couple things down there. So as you come into the memorial, you'll notice there are quotes by different people. In my opinion, this corner is one of the most important corners that's right here. On the inside of the memorial, I have presidential quotes. I have FDR on the east side, Truman on the west side. By each of the colonnades, I have quotes by an author talking about the Battle of Midway, and by General MacArthur, who was one of the commanders in the Pacific Theater of War. On the Atlantic side, I've got Marshall and Eisenhower. Right here, coupled with the FDR quote, where he talks about they've given their sons to military service and they went and stoked the furnaces of industry. I have a quote here from Colonel Oveta Culp. Oveta Culp was the first director of the Women's Army Corps. And what I have done then, as the architect here, I have elevated Oveta Culp to the same station as Admiral Chester Nimitz. What I've said is this idea that women served, and Colonel Culp in particular for her service, is just as important as what Admiral Nimitz did for the United States Navy and all of the U.S. forces in the Pacific. That's huge. Okay? I mean, that says this is more than a memorial for the men and women who died. The memorial here tells a story that covers American history, if you want. You know, I can tell you a story about different states, about the Dakotas. I can, you know, it's all here. Okay, but the fact that Oveta Culp and Chester Nimitz are on the same level is amazing to me. That we had the prescience to say, yeah, women were that important to the war effort of the United States. Now, 20 years after we did that, we're still struggling for things that women should rightfully have. And all the things that FDR is talking about here, where women went to work and supported the U.S. factories, well, that the transition from that, where we have 16 million men and women in uniform service in 1945 to less than 4 million in uniform service by the time the Korean War breaks out in 1950. Okay, so that's huge. That's a huge influx of returning men and women, mostly men, into the workforce, and that creates a lot of turmoil. And we're still trying to sort a lot of that out. Okay? All right, so I'm going to turn over the microphone to, unless somebody's got questions of what to see. We're going to go over by the Atlantic Arch, and Alex is going to talk to us over there.
But I've started over here because, and by the way, I need glasses. I am getting really old. Many things are going wrong. Thankfully, my brain hasn't broken down completely yet. But if you look over here, the one that isn't lit up, actually, it's tragic. It's really sad, and someone needs to be punished for this, is Virginia over there. Can you see Virginia? So do we have any Virginians here? We have a Virginian there, we have a Virginian there, we have two. Is that all? We only have two Virginians? A Virginian over here. The reason why I like this one here particularly is because many moons ago, over 20 years ago, I wrote a book called The Bedford Boys, which is about a community in central Virginia, Bedford, Virginia, around about 3,000 people in 1944. And on D-Day, they lost 19 guys from that one community, which is why the National D-Day Memorial is now in Bedford, Virginia, because it was the one Allied community that per capita lost more than any other. But imagine a community of just 3,000 on D-Day, 6th of June, 1944, most important day of the 20th century, if you're me. This one small town loses 19 kids. So I've been here many times, thankfully, and with several groups of students from Virginia, because it's a short bus ride. In fact, it's very, very close indeed. And I always make sure they go over there and they stand in front of Virginia there, because I think it's a wonderful state. It's one of the 6 states, although this isn't important to you, but I like saying it. It's one of the 6 states that I've lived in the last 30 years. And my 30th, not wedding anniversary, I didn't manage that one. I got to 25 though. 25's really pretty impressive, don't you think? No. Anyway, my 30th anniversary of living in this nation is about 6 days away. I came to the US in 1994. So what I'm going to do is like one of 6 states I've lived in. What I'm going to do is take you through very quickly, as quickly as possible. I'll try not to bore you, try not to put you to sleep just yet. I'm going to take you through half of World War II, if you're an American. So you have the Pacific Theater over there represented, the monument, part of the monument I'm going to walk you past is half of the history, basically. Later in the week, we'll come back and we'll look at the Pacific. It's not my favorite part of World War II, because it's basically about bestiality, barbarism, racism, and ultimately an atomic bomb. My favorite part of World War II, the part of World War II I've written 10 books about, is all about you guys, working class, predominantly Americans, liberating the place that I love, I'll be honest, as much as this great country, Europe. The European theatre here, and this is the Atlantic Arch. So, unbelievably, we have an actual veteran. We have this incredible gentleman who was 16 years old. You were 15 when he went in. But you were 16 when you actually saw combat. Yeah. And unbelievably, you were still 16 when you came home.
No, I was 17 2 months after the war ended. I was 17.
17?
2 months after the war ended.
Can you hear him okay?
Yeah, 2 months after the war ended, he was 17.
And then I stayed there for 3 years in 48. Then
Wow.
Then I went to Japan.
We're going to have a little, we'll hear more in a bit, okay? But join me when we start over here. I'm going to need a volunteer who has good eyesight. Can anybody read Braille so you can put your hands on the thing?
What do you mean, Brad?
Because it's starting to get decayed. So, importantly, over 400,000 Americans died in World War II. That's about half. People now agree, most people agree, it's about half of the number that were killed in the Civil War. And many of the casualties, many of the deaths in the Civil War were because we didn't have adequate medical facilities. If you were shot in the chest, if you had a chest wound, you basically died. In World War II, if you had a serious wound, if you were wounded, you went down, a medic came to you, got to you in time, within a few minutes, you had a less than 3% chance of dying in World War II. The advances not only in terms of women's rights, in terms of the profound segregation that occurred in this country that is still an issue, etc. So many things were radically changed by World War II, including medical provision. It was the envy of the world. I would rather have been shot in an American uniform than any other uniform in World War II. But 400,000 Americans died. 138,000 were killed to liberate Europe. The liberation of Europe began on November the 8th, 1942. Actually, unfortunately, in terms of making sense of this, in North Africa. But that was called part of the European Theatre of Operations. November 1942, first time that you could, sir, have been in an amphibious landing craft, landing on a hostile shore, could be killed. Average age of an American killed in the European theatre was 22. By 1944, 1945, the average age of a combat soldier, a replacement usually, was just 20 years old. You graduated high school, literally 3 months later, you could be in a foxhole in Europe. The fatalities are important to mention. This is the Freedom Wall, and there is a gold star representing every 1,000 fatalities in World War II. But that's just deaths, and I've already mentioned that less than 3% of people that were wounded actually died. So you have over 1 million casualties. 400,000 killed, over 1 million casualties. And what is never spoken about, what's not emphasized enough, is the psychological casualties. The psychiatric damage that was done is still being felt today. 14 million Americans served in uniform in World War II. There are less than 120,000 left alive today, which is why it's so amazing to have Harry with us. But of those less than 120,000, many of them are psychologically damaged to this day. They still have nightmares 80 years later. I mention this because the British lost 450,000. US population during World War II was about 120 million. Our population was about 50 million, and we lost over 450,000. Soviet Union, population around about 75 million in World War II, 20 million people killed. 12 million in uniform, some people say as many as 15, 20 even, civilians. The siege of Leningrad went on for almost 3 years. Imagine living in Leningrad in World War II. Civilians killed in World War II in Europe, 19 million. From 1939 to 1945, 19 million human beings with a beating heart died in the greatest conflict in human history. Most important conflict in history. Most significant conflict in history. The reason why the World War II Memorial is placed here between these two iconic greats in your history is because it's at the center of American history. And it's at the center of world affairs today. The world that you look at, the Atlantic Alliance, all the debates about NATO, all the worry that I mentioned about what role America plays in the world, that has been defined since 1945. The European Union came out of World War II. The reason why it exists to this day is because the Europeans have not forgotten the 19 million that were killed and don't want to repeat it. So I'm going to come over here, and I do need someone that can read Braille. Do you get taught to read Braille when you do teaching, when you learn to become teachers? No? Someone have good eyesight? Do you have good eyesight?
I can try.
Okay. So you can come a bit closer. The disadvantage of this technology is that no one comes closer, so you think no one's listening to you, which is probably a natural reaction, but anyway. Battle of the Atlantic is the longest continuous conflict of World War II. Began in 1939, ended in 1945. I had two grandfathers that both served in World War II. One of them died when my mum was about a year old. He was served in the British Navy. Volunteered in 1939, fought on 4 battleships, 2 escort destroyers, was in the Battle of the Atlantic. Other battles too. My other grandfather served in the Royal Air Force in Egypt, and he basically ended up running the black market there and had a wonderful war. And whenever I was with my grandmother, who'd lost her first husband, number one, the real one, sorry, I shouldn't say this, my real granddad, they would sit there on a couch with 5 dogs sat on them. They used to sleep with 5 dogs too. That's British for you. British people, by the way, care more about their dogs than they do their kids. You do too, yeah, okay. Hands up, who cares more about their dog than their kid? Sorry, that was, oh, here we go. Oh my God.
Bring your people.
We have more people here that care about their dogs than that come from Virginia. And I used to sit there and I used to listen to my grandfather, the number two guy, the RAF black market guy. And he would always tell these stories, and it's funny, you know, if you had a good war, if you didn't do that much, you often ended up talking about it. The people that were really involved, that saw combat, didn't talk about it. They talked about it with their friends 50, 60 years later when they felt in a safe environment. But the last thing that your dad was going to say to you, if he had been through what Harry had been through, if he'd really seen the shit, if you've been traumatized, because war traumatizes you. Even for half an hour, you're traumatized. You don't talk about it. You don't infect the people you love most that you've been praying that you'll see again. You don't tell them what happened. So anyway, my one grandfather who talked a lot, he would talk about what a wonderful war he had, you know? And I used to think, well, hang on a second. If it hadn't been for the other one, number one, dying, you wouldn't be here, mate. But anyway, Battle of the Atlantic. Murmansk, this is still part of the Battle of the Atlantic. The Murmansk run, who knows where Murmansk is? Can I ask a question? Do you know where Murmansk is? Russia. Very cold part of Russia in the winter. And you had horrific stories about British Navy, the Americans were involved in the Murmansk run. We were basically trying to supply the Red Army with everything we could give them. Convoys would come across the Atlantic from Halifax, from the eastern seaboard of the United States, escorted by the British Navy. Later on, after Pearl Harbor, you guys also provided escort. You were officially in the war. All the way through the war, the Atlantic was the lifeline of democracy. Only one democracy, let's not forget, in 1940, Britain. But for the fight against fascism, for the fight against what I believe is the greatest evil that mankind's ever known, which is Nazism, where you mechanically, industrially, with glee, killed 6 million Jews. Where in the summer of 1944, as I speak to you right now, 80 years ago, over 500,000 Hungarian Jews were killed at Auschwitz in less than 6 weeks. That's you and you every single second. That's what you guys were fighting against, even though you didn't know it. Even though most soldiers like Harry didn't know exactly what they were fighting against. By the end of the war, he did. Others that were lucky enough to be alive and liberated the concentration camps, they also knew what they defeated. Murmansk, you would walk out onto a boat at that angle, doing that in 40, 50-foot waves in January, and if you hadn't slept properly, which you hadn't, and you put your bare hand on metal, your hand would freeze to the metal. Huge losses. Sometimes 20 ships would leave, escorted by the British Navy, by my grandfather, who was on one of those escort ships, and maybe 18 would make it to 18 would be sunk, just 2 would make it to Murmansk. So then we have Tunisia, November 1942, first time Americans came off a landing craft. North Africa, Tunisia, North African campaign. And I have to look really carefully here. Sicily here. Oh, thank you, sir. Whenever I do that on my phone, I can never turn it off. That's always a problem. So Sicily is the first time that you guys start to actually die and fight and kill to liberate Europe. I would include Sicily as part of Europe. The Sicilians do not consider themselves part of Europe or Italy. They've been invaded hundreds of times, but Sicily, 10th of July, 1943. 3rd Infantry Division, one of the great US divisions. 45th Infantry Division. I wrote a book about a bloke from that division called Felix Sparks, who was there on day one, 10th of July 1943, second amphibious invasion for you guys in the European theatre. You invade Sicily. 38 days later, Patton arrives in Palermo as the conquering hero. Germans have been kicked out, Italians are out of the war, defeated. First major victory in Europe for Allied forces, Canadians, British, and the Americans. Patton was a superstar. 38 days. Problem is, 9/10 of the Germans, and they're the ones that are going to kill you, not the Italians. They were there with their suitcases packed with their cousins in Brooklyn on the beach on the 10th of July. And there are photographs that show Italians with their suitcases ready to go and see their cousins in Brooklyn. They didn't want to fight. The Germans did. 38 days, 9/10 of the Germans in Sicily get to mainland Italy, which is only a mile and a half from Palermo, across the Messina Straits. And so we have to launch a 3rd amphibious invasion. Salerno, September 1943, where we are nearly kicked back into the Mediterranean. We have our asses handed to us by the Germans. You're now in Europe, mainland Europe. Every yard you go, we're going to fight for it. Salerno, huge losses, very, very difficult fight. It came down to around 2 or 3 hours. 2 or 3 hours where a unit of Americans from the 45th Infantry Division stood and held and fired everything they had at the Germans, rushing at them in wave after wave of Panzer tanks. Very close. Black Wednesday, September the 13th, 1943. The war could have been very, very different indeed. Just a few Americans, maybe 300 or 400, which is a few, made a big difference. We were there to stay. Anzio. If you were in the 3rd Division, 3rd ID, most decorated division in US history, one of the regiments, the 15th Infantry Regiment, is by far the most decorated in US history. If you were in the 3rd ID, as an 18, 19-year-old, you came off a landing craft in North Africa, Arabs. You came off a landing craft in Sicily, Italians that didn't want to fight, thank God. You came off a landing craft in Salerno, Germans who did want to fight. And then you came off for the 4th time at Anzio in January 1944. We were stuck in Italy. 100,000 American casualties, a war that many people, a campaign that many people think that we shouldn't have fought. Churchill's bright idea. Let's hit the Germans through the soft underbelly of Europe. Horrific attrition. Mountain after mountain after mountain. If you look at a map of Italy, you just see one mountain range after another. 4,000 or 5,000 foot mountains all the way until you get north of Bologna. Napoleon said you never invade Italy from the heel. You come over the Alps, you come from the north. No one has succeeded in invading Italy, liberating that country or conquering it from the route that we took. Anzio was an attempt to break the stalemate in Italy. By December of 1943, we landed in September 1943 at Salerno. We push up, we take Naples, and then we push up towards Rome. But we're going the hard way, up a mountainous, jagged, bloody spine of mountain after mountain that didn't even have names on American maps. Imagine how dispiriting it is. Most of the people in this group have been killed in the last few days. You're their commanding officer. You're 22, 23. You're a lieutenant, a company commander. And you get to the top of a mountain, and you look over that mountain, and in the mist, you see another mountain. And beyond that, there's another mountain. And you know that the same's going to happen to the next group of young, raw Americans from Oklahoma and California, who knows where. Over and over again. And so we decided, let's end this BS. Let's get to Rome. First Axis capital that we could take. We've got to do an end run. Let's cut out the mountains. Let's launch an amphibious invasion at Anzio. Amazing success. Only 17 Americans killed on the 21st of January 1944. Problem is, we only landed 2 divisions, a British division and an American division. And the Germans waited. We didn't hit Rome. We could have been in there in 48 hours. We were too risk averse, like Gareth Southgate, the England manager, yesterday against Spain. We didn't attack fast enough. Didn't put everything into the fight. Waited. Germans encircled us at Anzio, and 3 months later, after 60,000 Allied casualties and 12,000 American fatalities, we finally broke out. You couldn't go anywhere above ground. If you went above ground, you ended up with what was called the Anzio crouch. You bent over like this because your whole idea is that if you want to live, you keep your head as close to the ground as possible. You go underground. Mud, rain, vicious German counterattack after counterattack. My book, The Liberator, tells the story of one guy, a company commander, a 26-year-old. There were 200 guys in the beginning of February 1944, landed at Anzio, 200 guys at the beginning of February 1944. He's the only survivor 3 weeks later. E Company, 157th Infantry Regiment, 45th Infantry Division. A bloody war of attrition. We finally break out in late May of 1944. We throw everything we've got. 10 times more American shells fired than German shells throughout the European theatre because of American housewives. That's why those words are over there, and they're not meaningless. Highest scoring sniper in World War II was a Soviet woman, 375 Nazis. Rifle, her uniform, the Jeep that she drove in, American housewives. That's why I say the Red Army and American housewives won World War II. I'm not that far wrong. We break out, 4th of June, we arrive in Rome. Mark Clark, 5th Army Commander, he's the Emperor of Rome, but only, guess what, for 2 days. And he looks at the newspaper on the 6th of June and he wakes up, been through this horrible experience, he's like, God damn it. I need some glory. My men need some glory. We've been fighting this war, it's been a horrific bloodbath, but we now are history makers. We're the liberators of Rome. 2 days later, after he liberates it, picks up a newspaper, D-Day, 6th of June 1944 in Normandy. And he said, we only had the headlines for 48 hours. What a shame. The Italian campaign, Po Valley is northern Italy, over here. The Italian campaign didn't end until the war ended on the 7th of May 1945. What we call now VE Day. Actually, it's the 8th of May, but the formal German surrender was on the 7th of May. We were still fighting in the foothills of the Alps almost a year after we landed there. Po Valley here, and then we come to Normandy. Now, Normandy doesn't just mean where we landed on the 6th of June 1944, over 150,000 Allied troops. 2/3 of the casualties were American, although you had less than half the force. How come you're taking most of the casualties and yet you've got only half the numbers? One word, Omaha. 2 words, Omaha Beach. 900 of you slaughtered in just a couple of hours on one of the 5 landing beaches in Normandy. Battle of Normandy ends on the 25th of August 1944 with the most joyous, happiest day in history, when the French and Americans liberated arguably the most beautiful city in the world, Paris. Over 100,000 Allied casualties, more than that Germans, but we'd taken Normandy. The first major success of what was known as Operation Overlord. Operation Overlord being the overall plan to liberate northwestern Europe from unprecedented evil. Saint-Lô is a city in Normandy. It's around about 50 miles south of Omaha Beach. It took us until the end of July 1944 to get there. The British and Canadian target on the 6th of June 1944 was a city called Caen. And the Canadians were in the outskirts by the time it was this time on D-Day, 6th of June. Lights fading, they're in the suburbs of Caen. Germans counterattack, we're out. It takes us another 7 weeks to get Caen, to take Caen. Massive tank warfare. We had the advantage of materiel. We had millions of American women liberated from slavery, domestic slavery, and their husbands for the first time in history. And not many of you, by the way, not a lot of you wanted to go back, which is why you stayed in the workforce, why you transformed America as much as anything else, because you didn't want to go back and be the good little housewife. You've made a wage, a very good wage, an increasing wage through World War II. But the one thing we had was American industrial might, women working their backsides off, 18-hour shifts, 6 days a week. And you also had, the Allies had rather, overwhelming superiority in air power. If you were a German in a jeep or a tank in Normandy in the summer of 1944 and you heard Allied airplanes, that's probably the last thing you were going to hear, unless you were lucky. But still, even though they were outmanned, even though they were massively outgunned, and even though they couldn't move anywhere in daylight without being killed, in all probability, they fought like demons. They fought extremely hard, and it wasn't even their country. They were superb soldiers. The air war, we should mention that, 28,000 men from the 8th Air Force alone. If you've seen Masters of the Air, that's about the 8th Air Force. It's about the Bloody Hundredth, the bomb group called the Bloody Hundredth in particular. 28,000 Americans killed in the 8th Air Force alone. You've got other air forces, you've got the 9th, you've got others, but one air force. If you arrived in Britain, in my country, in January 1943, as many of them did in the 8th Air Force, you had a 1 in 4 chance of being alive by the end of 1943 and getting a Christmas card. Highest casualties suffered, fatalities I should say, highest fatalities suffered by Americans in World War II, submarine service, the silent service. More than 1 in 4, because when you sink a submarine, it's hard to survive. That's the most dangerous job. Second most dangerous, 8th Air Force, 28,000. I mentioned earlier on that the liberation of Paris, as far as the correspondents who were there, and everybody was there, Hemingway, Ernie Pyle, my superstar, Steinbeck, Martha Gellhorn, you name it, they were all there in Paris on the 25th of August, because this was the happy story. This was the joyous story. This was the beautiful story. This is 19-year-old kid from Oklahoma getting mobbed by mademoiselles, pouring vino down his throat, showering him with roses. This is the beautiful story. It's still the most beautiful episode from World War II, I believe. But beyond Paris, you have the rest of France, and then you have Nazi Germany. Alsace is on the German border, and there, after Paris falls on the 25th of August, in September and October we move towards what's called the Hirken Forest. That's about 50 miles from the German border. High fir trees. If you didn't have a compass at night, you'd get lost. Most American casualties were caused by tree bursts. That's shells exploding 20, 30 feet above me. And unless you're really, really smart and counterintuitive, and you hug the tree, you get killed by shards of wood from the tree burst. The smart thing to do, if you had your wits about you, and who would, is to hold the tree because you've got minimum exposure to the shards of wood. A horrific, horrific battle. Longest single battle waged on land in the European theatre by American forces. Began in September 1944, didn't end until December 1944, and it is a defeat. Didn't really go anywhere. 9 US divisions, average number in the division is about 12,000, over 100,000 Americans thrown into what they called the meat grinder. And they didn't go anywhere. That's a defeat, if you ask me. People don't talk about it, you don't hear about it in history books that much, because people don't like to talk about defeats. They like to talk about Paris, an ultimate victory. Then we have the Rhineland. We're getting very close to Nazi Germany. Over 4 million Germans died in uniform in World War II. 3/4 of them on the Eastern Front. So yes, Putin does have a reason to say to us, by the way, don't forget what we did in World War II. We were your most important ally, and they were, by far. They did most of the bleeding, most of the dying. The Rhineland is right on the German border. We liberate Paris the 25th of August. We're moving towards Nazi Germany. We're only 50, 60 miles away in the fall of 1944. And we're stuck in the Rhineland, on the German border, going nowhere for almost 6 months. I mentioned the Hirken Forest here. That's the classic example of how tough the fighting was. as we neared Germany. And now we have the Battle of the Bulge, which our esteemed guest is fought in. But he's over there somewhere, I think, sitting down. Battle of the Bulge begins on the 16th of December 1944. It's the deadliest battle you guys fought in World War II. 18,000 killed. It's deadlier even than Okinawa and Iwo Jima, which were bloodbaths. 16th of December ended at the end of January 1945. Biggest battle fought in US history by the US Army. Over 800,000 Americans involved. So if you have a deceased World War II relative who fought in the European theatre, they're more than likely to have been lost or fought in the Battle of the Bulge. Biggest battle you ever fought. In the coldest winter in European living memory. And I thought this is a bunch of BS. All these soldiers and veterans saying it was colder than it had ever been. It was the coldest winter ever. So I did some research and I worked out that actually, on average, in December of 1944 and January 1945, it was 4 or 5 degrees colder than it usually was. So it actually was really, really, really cold. If you're in a foxhole, you two guys are in a foxhole, you would hug each other. Not because you liked each other particularly, although you probably would. So you could share body warmth. And if you fell asleep, you would expect your foxhole buddy to wake you up so you didn't freeze to death. It's that cold. Don't worry guys, we're almost at the end. Remagen Bridge. I have a crazy story about this. I'm really near the end here. I went to Rapid City. Which state is that, please? Where is Rapid City? Thank you. Do we have anybody from the Dakotas here? Any South Dakotans? Any North Dakotans?
I'm from Montana originally.
Okay, yeah, that's close enough. That's fine. That's not bad. I went out to Rapid City. I got in a hire car. I went to see Mount Rushmore. Not bad. It's okay. Not as cool as Buckingham Palace, but it's all right, you know. I'm a Republican with a small R, by the way. Anyway. And I go to this trailer park on the outskirts of Rapid City, and I'm like, okay, this is a bit weird. Dirt road. I go to this trailer, and I'm thinking, does anybody live in this trailer? There's no way that someone could live in this trailer. There's junk everywhere. I knock on the front door of this trailer, and it takes 10 minutes for the door to answer. And I'm like, is the person here alive? I open the door, and the first thing I see is like dozens of Father Christmases. And a 98-year-old guy answers the door, and he's called Paul Priest. And his hobby at the end of World War II was being a looter and a pillager. He liked to collect SS daggers and pistols, anything with a Nazi flag on it. And in the back of his trailer, he had a whole room full of all the loot that he brought back somehow. And a lot of guys brought a lot of stuff back. Americans were known for being looters, not rapists like the Red Army, who raped a woman in Vienna every 8 minutes when they liberated it, who raped over 50% of any female in Berlin when they liberated that city. You guys didn't do that. Well, you did, obviously, but in very, very, very small numbers relative to other countries. But you like to loot, you like to nick stuff and bring it home. I don't know what that is about the American character, but it's great if you collect SS memorabilia, because it's all over this country. So the guy answers the door. I sit down with him, I look at all the Father Christmases, because he collects those too. Got a massive collection. And I sit down with him, and the reason I went there is because he's the last living American who crossed the Ludendorff Bridge on the 7th of March 1945. And all you guys are looking at me like, oh my God, it's really getting a bit warm now. I've been here listening to this crazy Brit for way too long. What is he talking about? Ludendorff Bridge, who gives a toss? 7th of March, just one day from the war. The reason why Remagen's on there is because 7th of March 1945, Paul Priest, he stole 2 pistols off 2 dead German officers. He never carried a rifle. He was in a reconnaissance unit. It was his job to go through the woods at night and find out where the Germans were and not be detected. He said if I carried an M1 rifle and I was going through the undergrowth or past a tree, they'd hear it. I'd brush against the tree branches. So I carried just 2 pistols, shoulder holster here, shoulder holster here. Talk about an American cowboy. Badass. The best of you, you know? John Wayne, the real guy. And he had a German pistol here, so that if he came up to someone close, he'd just pull the pistol out, bang, you're gone. So I sit there, and he shows me the pistols and everything, and he also pulls out a lump of rock from the Ludendorff Bridge. He was in the group of the first 50 or 60 Americans that saw the bridge, and they couldn't believe it. 40 bridges across the Rhine. The Rhine is the last obstacle. It's the last gate that we have to smash open before we can put these Germans down there kneeling, as Churchill said, kneeling prostrate before us. Kneeling. The last bridge, Ludendorff. They get to a hill, they look down, they go, oh my God, I can't believe it, it's still standing. Germans are supposed to have blown this sky high. Paul Priest, around 2 o'clock in the afternoon on the 7th of March 1945, there are 60 girders across that span of the Rhine. He goes from one to another. And I said to him, how do you do that? He said, we listened for when the Germans reloaded the machine guns, because the rate of fire was less. It's not just a pop, 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 pop. It's like a massive pop going across your head. All you can hear is pop, 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 pop. And he said, when we can only hear a pop, pop, then we ran from one girder to the other. He gets across. He's in the first dozen guys to get across the Ludendorff Bridge, 7th of March 1945. Eisenhower, Allied Supreme Commander, one of your greatest presidents, definitely your greatest ever military commander. I love Ike, don't just like him. Said it was the biggest break of the war because within a week, 100,000 of you guys were deep into the heart of the Nazi beast, into the heart of the Third Reich. And Hitler knew the game was up. Last massive, important chapter in World War II was getting across the Rhine. What we intended to do from the moment the Japanese killed over 2,000 of you at Pearl Harbor. Germans declared war on you. You didn't declare war on them. What would have happened if they hadn't declared war on you? From the moment that America entered a two-theater war, the Pacific and the European theater, thousands and thousands and thousands of miles away from where it's standing right here. World War II was not fought at home, except by women and the mothers and the families that lost sons. It was fought in jungles, thousands of miles away, in forests like the Hurtgen, far, far from this country. Reason why Europeans hate war is because they had to live through a battlefield. It was a battlefield. America was not a battlefield. Only less than 5 civilian fatalities in the mainland US in World War II. We get across the Rhine. Almost 140,000 of you have died to get there. It's what Marshall and Roosevelt tragically didn't get to see, but what he hoped for, and what every family in this country hoped for. Once you're across the Rhine, the dying will end. And Paul Priest is a big deal because he was one of those few guys that got across that bridge, and he shortened the war by weeks, if not months. And he saved countless lives. Because once we're across, game over. That's why I went to see him. Cool guy. Right, finally, here we go. And then we can get back on the bus. Germany, 7th of May 1945. 2:41 a.m. in a schoolhouse in Rheims in France. Not in Germany, in Rheims in France. A 54-year-old American smoking 4 packs of filterless cigarettes a day, 2 or 3 martinis in the evening sometimes, ringing in his ear because he's so stressed. Has been signing so many documents that he's got a shake in his hand and he has to have someone help him. Dwight Eisenhower sends a message to where we're standing right now, to the combined chiefs of staff. And he says the mission of this Allied Expeditionary Force has been completed. 2:41 a.m. European time. He'd just taken the formal German surrender, literally only half an hour before. General Jodl had come in to an office with Eisenhower, and Eisenhower had said, I'm not going to ever shake, and I'm paraphrasing now, a goddamn Nazi's hand. And he never did. Even in the moment of surrender, when, as Churchill said, they were prostrate before us, Eisenhower refused to shake their hand. And I know why. I'm convinced I know why. Because it killed way too many good young Americans. You'd come and saved our ass in World War I less than a generation ago. Finished the job. You did. Defeated Germany in 1918. And then over 130,000 have to die to bring peace again to what was a benighted continent. 2 times in a generation. He wasn't going to shake any Nazi's hand. He wasn't going to shake a German's hand. When Eisenhower went to Ohrdruf on the 12th of April 1945, it was the first concentration camp that senior American officers had visited. Patton, Bradley, Eisenhower. Eisenhower left as white as a sheet. And he saw a young American as a guard on the outskirts of Ohrdruf who was smiling for some reason. And he turned to him and he snapped at him. And he said, "You hate them now? What's it going to take for you guys to hate these people? You had a big problem in World War II. You had a really big problem. You didn't hate the Germans enough. No problem in the Pacific. You really hated them. They started it. They were yellow. They looked like monkeys. They could be dehumanized. You could wipe out 70,000 in one click. Faster than that at Hiroshima. No problem. It's a race war. This is against your cousin, your uncle. You come from Minnesota, Illinois, Iowa. 2/3 of Americans can trace their heritage genetically to Germans. You're killing your own kind. They look just like me and you. I'm having to shoot you in the head, you're having to shoot me in the head. It's hard, really hard. Less than 1/3 of Americans in a firefight in all of these battles that I've shown you, all the way to the end. Less than 1/3 when they were being fired upon. When you could go home in a coffin, less than 1/3 of your fellow Americans would return fire. Because as Roosevelt said, you were drawn from the ways of peace and democracy, not barbarism and ideological hatred. You'd worked that out in the Civil War. You were a union. You were a peaceful people, not murdering barbarians. Korea, it's 50%. Vietnam, over 90%. And in the War of Terror, you fire every time. Germany is defeated on the 7th of May, VE Day, the 8th of May, ends the war in Europe. A couple of statistics. 80 years to this day, there hasn't been a war in northwestern Europe. The place that you landed on June the 6th, 1944, all the way to Germany, a long, bloody journey, has lived in peace and democracy ever since. Second statistic. In opinion polls in 1945 around the globe, and I will end after this, I want you to walk away with this, looking at this beautiful memorial. In opinion polls, in surveys taken in Britain, in other places, including in the defeated nations, Germany and Japan, which, by the way, you rebuilt and you restored through your tax dollars. And by the way, are still very good allies, even though they don't pay for their own defense, which they have to do. They have to start changing that. In opinion polls, surveys around the globe, in 1945, America was the most respected nation on the planet. Ever since, it has never been more respected. The moral authority, the power, the glory, the heroism, the achievement has never been equal in all your history. Because this was not about you. You only had 5 people killed in this country. It was about me and millions of people who were oppressed and actually happened to like living in freedom. You liberated Europe and you defeated barbarism in the Pacific. It's the greatest story, if you're an American, ever told. But it's important to see it through the rest of the world's eyes. You can't understand that magnificence unless you are someone that was liberated. That's just half the story. Thanks, guys. You're awesome.